The most prominent location on New Hampshire's coast, Portsmouth was not only a seaport, but during the latter half of the 19th century, it became a railroad center served by no less than 6 railroads. The first to connect Portsmouth with other cities was the Eastern Railroad, which was completed to Boston in 1840. Then, the line to Portland, Maine was completed in 1842 and was known as the Portland, Saco, and Portsmouth Railroad. In the year 1848, the Portsmouth and Concord Railroad had reached Epping and was completed to Concord in 1852. The Portsmouth and Dover Railroad was in operation by 1873. The other 2 railroads that entered Portsmouth via the Portland, Saco, and Portsmouth Railroad were the Portsmouth, Great Falls, and Conway Railroad, joining the PS&P at Conway Junction, and the York, Harbor, and Beach Railroad joining the PS&P at Kittery Junction. Needless to say, none of these names exist today, as one by one they became properties of the Boston and Maine system.
Portsmouth was a thriving industrial center early in the 20th century and furnished the railroads with many tons of revenue, as well as a profitable passenger business. In 1905, there were 358,918 tons of coal handled at the Boston and Maine coal pocket alone, and over 500,000 tons shipped inland, much of this going to Manchester for the large cotton mills. Another large industry in Portsmouth were the breweries, the largest being the Frank Jones Brewing Company Limited. This complex covered 15 acres and had 51 buildings. To serve this, there were 2 miles of railroad track and 2 switcher locomotives. In the early 1900s, this brewery had an output of 250,000 barrels of the famous Frank Jones Ale. In 1889, Frank Jones actually became president of the Boston and Maine Railroad. The Eldridge Brewery had a capacity of 300 barrels a day. As hard as the local citizenry tried, they could not consume all of those suds, so there were many barrels left for railroad shipment. Like many other New England cities, the industrial scene also changed in Portsmouth. Prohibition brought about the closing of its great breweries, then the closing of the large textile mills in Dover and Manchester, and many other industries converting from coal to oil brought an end to the many tons of coal that were shipped from the coal pockets along the Piscataqua River. All of this cut heavily into Portsmouth's freight business.
Following World War II, Portsmouth remained an important location on the Boston and Maine. Passenger service was still present, with the Eastern Route Main Line seeing service from Boston through Portsmouth towards Portland until 1952, when Portsmouth became the new northern terminus of that line. Freight service remained busy as the steam era transitioned into the diesel era, and switchers still worked the many customers and yard here in Portsmouth into the mid-1980s. Switchers also crossed the Piscataqua River on the Sarah Mildred Long Bridge over to Kittery and ran down a stub of the old York, Harbor, and Beach Railroad to serve local customers as well as the naval shipyard. And a stub of the old Dover and Portsmouth Railroad up to Newington held and still serves many customers today. And that line can be seen behind me, known as the Newington Industrial Track. At one point, a spur left that industrial track, crossed the Spalding Turnpike at grade, and wound its way into the property of Pease Air Force Base. During the Cold War, aviation fuel and base supplies were frequent traffic, but that spur has been lost to time.
Passenger service on the Portsmouth branch from Concord and Manchester lasted until 1954, using a gas-powered rail car for daily except Sunday passenger service, mornings and evenings. After 1954, the local freight on the Portsmouth branch carried a wooden combine coach for passenger service until 1960, though there was likely little patronage except rail fans. The B&M pulled the plug on long-distance passenger service from Boston on January 3, 1965. The final passenger train, Train 232, using a single Budd RDC-1, number 6132, departed the station. Despite the formal end of passenger service, rail enthusiast fan trips visited Portsmouth in 1967 and 1982. The passenger station was eventually demolished, and although the turntable and engine house were used by the B&M's Portsmouth switcher until 1980, they too have deteriorated and soon will be lost to redevelopment.
Portsmouth has changed a lot since the 1970s, when the railroad here still had more of an active presence. The city has shifted from a grittier seaport location to a desirable place for living and work, with property and commerce becoming increasingly valuable. Despite that, there is still a lot of important industry in Portsmouth and Newington, and the railroad has, in recent years, begun a resurgence in freight service to New Hampshire's only seaport, particularly the shipment of propane gas, lumber, plastic pellets, and other commodities. This has prompted the railroad's new owners, CSX Transportation, to undergo major track improvements here in the last few years. Due to the proximity of the railroad here in Portsmouth to new condo and apartment developments, there has been some tension from newer residents who may not be explicitly aware of the railroad's long presence and history here in Portsmouth. Despite the march of time, Portsmouth's existence as a seafaring town remains as the city changes around it. The railroad persists too, and so the coexistence of these lifestyles, the gritty and the posh, the old and the new, will no doubt lead to new and interesting chapters of history here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire.